Dear Excellencies, distinguished guests, fellow Rwandans here present, it's a humbling moment to stand before you making a presentation on genocide ideology as portrayed on the agenda, particularly on this 32nd memory of the genocide against the Tutsi that took place in 1994. As we look at the theme today, that remember, unite, and renew, the question that should come to mind is that what is the impediment to this theme, to this subject matter of discussion? And we'll find there are many impediments, but one of them is going to be genocide denial, genocide ideology. It's going to be revisionism, it's going to be negationism, and all those other related offenses, which we are going to talk about today. So, before we go any further, it's an opportune moment that we reflect back and look at what do we mean by genocide before even we go into the meaning of genocide denial or genocide ideology. And we'll make a reference to the 1948 Genocide Convention, which most of our states have ratified. If you look at its Article 2, it provides, or it is defined, that genocide is any of the acts that are committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part one of the four protected groups. And I want to mention that the convention was clear enough to exhaustively provide for the four protected groups, which are mainly a national group, religious group, ethnic group, and racial group. And we cannot add to those groups. You cannot add political group, you cannot add any social group, you cannot add any other group, economic group. Why did the convention limit itself, or why did the state parties limit themselves to the only four protected groups to be the ones that comprise the definition of genocide? It's because of the nature of these groups. If you look at their nature, they all carry the nature of permanency, stability, and vulnerability, to the fact that you cannot merely change from one national to another, and you cannot easily change from one ethnic group to another. And it's not easy either to change from one race to another. And maybe you may argue that when it comes to religious group, one can be from this religion and the other time they can change. But it has been proven that for certain religions, it is embedded in culture that you cannot just merely change religion. So that is why the convention, and which is also in many of our domestic jurisdictions and laws, has limited itself to just the four protected groups. Coming back to the genocide that happened in Rwanda, it is the genocide against the Tutsi, which covers one of the protected groups, which is the genocide against the Tutsi, or the ethnic group. Ladies and gentlemen here present, particularly the young generation, we find that even when we look at other genocides that have happened elsewhere, we talk about the Holocaust, and we say the genocide against the Jews. We talk about the genocide against the Bosnians. We talk about the genocide against the Armenians. But the problem with the deniers, they always want to say genocide that happened in Rwanda, genocide against Rwandans, and they intentionally omit genocide against the Tutsi, which is another form of denying genocide, and also misrepresenting the laws and the convention, which says that genocide should be targeting a specific group. So by merely denying to say genocide against the Tutsi, it is one of the forms of denial, because genocide is not a mere act. It has to be intentionally intended to destroy one of the four protected groups. Reason as to why today we call upon the right theme, the right naming of the genocide that happened in Rwanda, which is genocide against the Tutsi. And one will wonder, with all the challenges that Rwanda had to go through after the genocide against the Tutsi, the path that it has chosen. It took the path to dismantle all the ethnic divisions that had contributed and led to the genocide against the Tutsi, and removed all the structure that was all based on ethnic or politicized ethnic divisions, and decided to empower or to put in place inclusive governance and power sharing. Of course, that was in addition to one single identity being promoted, which we usually say, Ndu Munyarwanda. And we all know, or most of us know, Ndu Munyarwanda. I'm Rwandan, Setu. We don't add anything. I'm Tutsi. I'm neither Tutsi or Hutu or Twa, because of what it contributed. And this goes along with justice, or had to go along with justice, reconciliation, truth, forgiveness as the pillars to form sustainable reconciliation. However, we find that even with those efforts 32 years ago, we still face deniers. Even with the evidence, even if we see what we were going through today, the testimonies, the vivid and live testimonies, when we look at the ICTR judgments, when we look at people, the convicts that have confessed to their crimes, when we look at the fact that the UN has recognized genocide against the Tutsi, but still we have so many people around in Rwanda and outside Rwanda that still want to distort this historical truth. So the question that comes to mind, what could be the purpose of these deniers, even with that sufficient existing evidence that genocide happened in Rwanda and it targeted the Tutsis? So I will not talk about all the forms, all the reasons, and all the aims, but if we just mention a few, you will find that most of the deniers, or mainly who include genocide fugitives, or deniers themselves, and their affiliated so-called advocacy groups. So their aim, you find that they want to distort the historical truth, mainly the planning stage. As we went through the definition of genocide, we saw that it is the intent to destroy in whole or in part. So there has to be that planning, which they always want to say, no, there was no planning of the genocide. It was a spontaneous act. There were spontaneous killings, which is not true, because when we see the facts at hand, when we look at the ICTR judgments, we find that genocide was planned, organized, and it went through all the incitement elements before it was executed in 1994. And the other reason, apart from distorting or trying to create another narrative that there was no planning of the genocide, you find that these deniers, they aim at minimizing the genocide. And they will always look at the death, the toll numbers, and they will say, no, actually, the numbers of the victims were exaggerated. And they forget that the convention that we refer to, the different laws, we don't look at the numbers when it comes to genocide. We look at the intention. What was the intention of the perpetrator? Whether they killed 2 or 5 people, that doesn't matter. We look at their intention, which was to destroy the entirety or the existence of the group or the substantial part of the group, and it was stopped for reasons beyond their control. So it's not about the numbers, it's about the intent to destroy the existence of a group, the killing of a group, the extermination or the annihilation and the destruction of the entire group. So those are some of the reasons why we see genocide deniers advancing their agenda, their narrative, which is to be countered as the international community are present. Apart from distorting or denying the planning stage or minimizing the numbers of the genocide victims, you will also find a shared intention with these deniers. They will always do or create, and I've talked about 3, but maybe it is also important to bring in the other element of some of the deniers. Some of the deniers deny genocide or counter the facts of the genocide based on false accusations and facts, based on the fact that they carry a guilt. and they forget or are guilt maybe based on belonging, identity, some of their family members, or even negative solidarity. But they ignore the fact that when you look at the Rwanda narrative, what Rwanda advances is not every Hutu participated in the genocide. That's why we have had trials by Gacaca courts. We have had over 1.9 million cases being tried, which individualized crimes. We have ICTR trials, we have national courts trials, we have trials that have happened in different jurisdictions in Europe and across. So all of those have individualized or have led to the concept of individual criminal responsibility. When it comes to crimes, there is no collective responsibility. There is individualization, meaning that those who are guilty, those who have participated are known. So it's not about collective responsibility. Whoever was accused has been convicted, but it doesn't concern any ethnic group. So allow me continue that, except the deniers that we've talked about and their affiliated organized groups and the genocide fugitives, the critics, the political critics, sadly, we also have another emerging category from the international community that always or that joins the movement of the deniers, and that is very sad because remember, genocide is an international crime. So, and this includes some of the foreign states and international organizations. But for them, when they deny genocide, they will do it under the disguise of political narrative, human rights, advocacies, or they will bring in the concept of freedom of speech. And this is to ignore the fact that when it comes to freedom of speech, yes, it is a right under the law, but it's not an absolute right. And when we look at the different laws internationally, we find that freedom of speech is not an absolute right when it comes to killing a protected group, when it comes to the intention to deny existence of another group. So in as much as it is a right, but it has a limitation when it comes to the right to life of another group that has been protected by the law, by the 1948 Genocide Convention. Ladies and gentlemen, do we want to mean that it's a journey that we have failed as the international community, as a country, as survivors, as individuals? This is not what we are advancing. We are not helpless about it. That is why we take this as an opportune moment during Kwibuka32, so that we bring it out, we share the challenges, we share the issues, and then devise ways of fighting genocide ideology. If genocide could be stopped, what about genocide ideology, genocide denial, revisionism, and etc.? So allow us share the concerns, but also share what we think should be the solution to fighting genocide ideology. And we'll just provide 3 elements that could be helpful. One, we call upon UN member states that are here present to enact legislation that punishes genocide denial so that we are able to prevent this danger, and where we cannot prevent it, then we are able to punish it. And we want to commend some of the states, particularly on the European continent, starting from Germany, Switzerland, Belgium, and France, that have enacted legislation against genocide denial. We also commend the efforts of France with its recent trials for genocide ideology and genocide denial and hate speech. The second call that we have today is to request countries here present, and even the whole of the international community, that over 32 years, or 32 years after the genocide against the Tutsi, Rwanda has issued indictments and international arrest warrants to different countries. And we find still thousands of genocide fugitives that are roaming freely in different countries. They have made those countries a safe haven, and those are the ones that still keep contributing to the genocide denial that we are talking about today. So we request that these fugitives on the different continents, on the different, in the different countries, because they are across Europe, North America, on the African countries, that they should be prosecuted in those respective countries. And where they can't be prosecuted, then they should be extradited to willing states like Rwanda. And we follow this looking at a resolution, the UN Security Council Resolution 2150 that was passed in 2014. It called upon member states to prosecute within their jurisdictions genocide fugitives, that is genocide against the Tutsi, and where they cannot, they should be able to extradite them back to Rwanda and other willing states. And it's not even that resolution of 2014. Even when we look under international customary law, it's a prerequisite. You prosecute for any offender who has committed international crimes. And where you cannot, then you should be able to extradite. Members, ladies and gentlemen, allow me also have a third call to action as the international community, as we gather today and as we commemorate. Let us make the word never again a reality, not just an idle word, not just an idle slogan, not just a repetitive word, but let it be a collective responsibility for all of us to say that genocide should never happen anywhere else, Rwanda, in the Great Lakes region, and across the globe. And ladies and gentlemen, allow me or permit me, as I come to a conclusion, in the next 2 to 3 minutes, I'll make my conclusion as follows. Today, as we gather under the theme, Remember, Unite, Renew, we remember more than 1 million innocent lives lost during the genocide against the Tutsi in 1994. We honor their memory, stand with survivors, and pay tribute to those who stopped the genocide against Tutsi and gave Rwanda a chance to live again. But remembrance is not only about the past. It is also about taking responsibility for the present and for the future. The genocide against the Tutsi was not an accident of history. It was planned, organized, and executed by the leaders, institutions, and extremist forces. In just 100 days, a nation was devastated. This truth is not open to debate, no longer open to debate, and never open to debate. Because this truth, it's a matter of historical and legal record. And yet, 32 years later, the fight for truth still continues. Genocide denial and revisionism have not disappeared. They have evolved. Today, they spread through social media, through organized networks, and through narratives that distort the history. They minimize the crime, or they create false equivalencies. And we should note that these are not harmless opinions. They are a continuation of the same ideology that led to the genocide against the Tutsi in 1994. We must be clear that silence and indifference allow these dangers to grow or to keep growing. At the same time, Rwanda stands as a powerful example of what is possible after tragedy. Through unity, reconciliation, and a shared national identity, the Munyarwanda, Rwandans have rebuilt and continue to rebuild their country. Today, over a big percentage of Rwandans identify strongly with national unity and reconciliation. This is not recovery, it is resilience. But even with this progress, the work is not finished. Survivors continue to heal, and the presence of genocide denial in some communities reminds all of us here present that vigilancy must never stop. This is why Kwibuka32 is not only Rwanda's moment, it's a global call to action. We want to call upon the international community to uphold the truth, to respect denial in all its forms, and to fulfill their obligations to prevent and to punish genocide. Justice must be done, but it also must be seen to be done. Never again must be meaningful everywhere. As we remember, let us also unite, and as we unite, let us renew our commitment, not just in words, but in action, because the future we build today depends on the truth that we defend today. So this is why Kwibuka32, as you already said, is not just Rwanda's moment, it's a global call to action. It should not depend on different things. It should not depend either on political relations, political tensions, and neither should it be affected by political conspiracies and seasonal conflicts. It cannot be postponed based on either the surfacing political mood in the region and on the international scene. It's everyone's duty. Genocide is an international crime, and it's not Rwandan. This is the least we can do to honor the memory of the genocide against the Tutsis. Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, thank you very much for your esteemed attention.